Barely a week goes by without things occurring that would have been inconceivable 3 years ago. Russian territory being hit by American-made munitions, history's most substantial sanctions placed against Russia, and a near coup or mutiny against the Kremlin last year when Prigozhin marched on Moscow. We've also seen Putin going cap in hand to Kim-Jong-Un to prop up his ailing military. But it seems that Russia has retained the escalation initiative, and the West are always playing catch up, always reactive. This is not a way to beat Russia. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Mick Ryan, a retired Major General in the Australian Army, a graduate of the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and the US Marine Corps University Command and Staff College and School of Advanced Warfighting. He has commanded at platoon, squadron, regiment, task force, and brigade level. In January 2018, he assumed command of the Australian Defence College in Canberra, Australia. In 2021, he was an adjunct scholar at the Modern War Institute. He completed his 35-year career with the Australian Army and transitioned to the Army Reserve as a Major General in February 27th, 2022. His book, War Transformed, was published the same year. After that, White Sun War, The Campaign for Taiwan, was published in 2023, and his latest book, The War for Ukraine, Strategy and Adaptation Under Fire, will be released on 13th of August this year. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like, subscribe, definitely add a comment. It helps people to discover fantastic guests like Mick Ryan and others. And it also helps to get the truth out about why Ukraine needs to resist. Please do also check out the validated Ukrainian charities. It's incredibly important that we help Ukraine remain resistant at this time. After you've done that, please do consider becoming a patron or buy me a coffee to support the work of the channel. Mick, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to Silicon Curtain.
No, thank you. It's great to be here.
I got lots of ideas last night from your session on Marita Report. That is an incredible place to find different angles and, of course, to get a realistic picture about what is going on, because a lot of this is not being covered in the media. And when it is, it's usually the sensational stories like the strike on Monday, and it's not covered with tremendous depth. Do you find it troubling that the largest land war in Europe since the Second World War, a war on extraordinary scale with incredible brutality, is getting this little coverage?
No, it is disturbing. I think that politicians quietly hope that it would just go away, but it's not just the largest land war in Europe since the Second World War. It's the most important war geopolitically in the 21st century so far. I mean, this has profound importance for the future of democracies. Are they willing to defend other democracies? Are they willing to defend those who offer alternative models to their more repressive neighbours? And Ukraine, the Baltics, and places like Taiwan are the kind of countries that are in the crosshairs of authoritarians like Putin and Xi. The next couple of decades, we'll see whether we are willing to do the hard things to defend them or not.
And this channel, people watching this channel will have heard this message over and over, that Russia is not just engaged in a local, regional conflict over land and resources, but is involved in a geopolitical struggle that is comparable to the activities of the Soviet Union. And one of its primary aims is to degrade democracy, degrade institutions, make them meaningless and ineffectual, and reduce their validity even in the eyes of their populations. And of course, there are new tools that weren't available to the Soviet Union that allow them to do that, including information warfare. That scale of the struggle, is that something you think that still hasn't quite landed with many politicians?
No, I don't think so. I mean, this is a global ideological battle. On one side, you have what I call the authoritarian quad of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. They may not be allies, but they are working to a common cause at the moment, which is degrade and eventually destroy the system that was established at the end of the Second World War to underpin the prosperity of all nations, but also to do what it could to prevent future catastrophic wars like that was experienced in Asia and in the Pacific during the Second World War. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea all think they have a better model. What that is, no one really knows, except that it would involve fewer liberties for individuals, less democracy for many countries, and frankly, I think a much darker 21st century than we should hope for.
And the Russian theory, looking at some of the military theorists and, of course, the propagandists, there is both an explicit and an implicit desire to re-establish what I think is a very sort of 19th century concept, which is spheres of influence as opposed to international law. It comes through extremely clearly. Partly it's expressed in academic language, but you can also feel it in the genocidal language of many of the propagandists. The idea that Georgia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine especially, Belarus and others, and they're starting to extend it to the Baltics, do not have full sovereignty, do not have valid sovereignty, that somehow this concept of spheres of influence means that there are tier 1 countries, tier 2 countries, and then non-countries. And of course, Ukraine fits into that category in the mind of Russia. With this ideology, again, this seems to me not a question of this war being over and then we can all, pack our bags and go home. This seems to be an ideology which would generate endless warfare.
No, absolutely. I mean, the great moral challenge with spheres of influence is that one country has full agency and everyone else has no agency. If you extend this idea of spheres of influence, all that matters is the aspirations of the country that's at the center of it, and everyone else doesn't get a choice. So, for example, in the Western Pacific, if you think that China has a sphere of influence, you then have to assume that Korea, the Republic of Korea, Vietnam, Philippines, Japan have no agency, that their views on how they should run their country, rule their citizens, of no importance because those of China are more important. Now, clearly, that is a legally and morally bankrupt view, but there are some who are happy to push that view, including in our own countries.
And we've got the NATO summit coming up, and obviously there's lots of the usual sort of PR noises implying that this is going to be a fantastic event. It's the 75th anniversary. Normally there'd be lots of backslapping and self-congratulation, but it does seem like there are some clear divisions in the way forward and how to defeat Russia. You've got the Baltics right there ahead. I'll call it realistic as opposed to hawkish. I'm sure that would be your characterization as well. You've got the Nordics broadly who are in line with that. Britain, who is I think very firmly in that camp as well. But then you have Berlin and Washington, who seem to have a very different and much more reactive view. And in fact, we see the red lines, and we can deconstruct the red lines and whether they have any meaning militarily. But it seems the underlying purpose is not to enable Ukrainian victory, but a desperation to keep Russia intact, to keep Putin's regime intact. As vile and vicious as it is, there seems to be a real fear of it collapsing and what the alternative system might be on that territory.
Yeah, I think there has been that fear. I think many are getting over that fear because they realise it actually can't get any worse than Putin. What he is doing, not just to Ukraine, but has threatened to do to his neighbours, is about as bad as it gets, with the exception of using nuclear weapons. And, Russia always has them there. So I think if you take consideration of them away, it's hard to imagine a worse regime in Russia than the one they have at the moment. Certainly, it's hard to imagine one that's more dangerous, not just to Europe, but also to its own people. So I think, and I hope, more people are coming to the realization that, we need to destroy the Russian military inside Ukraine. They have to be totally taken off the table, whether defeated, destroyed, or a combination. And if that somehow causes the fall of the Putin regime, well, we'll deal with that. But the fall of the Putin regime can't be any worse than this appalling attempted genocide that you see Russia trying to undertake against the Ukrainian people, and potentially in the future against places in the Baltics, Finland, and these kind of countries as they threaten to.
And on Monday, we saw the horrific strike. I mean, those who've been living under this Russian bombardment will see this as just one more in a series of horrific acts. It does take something like this to grab the attention of the media, and then we sort of fall back to sleep until the next one. It's interesting, however, to observe the reaction of decision makers. There are noises coming out that the US will significantly ramp up the supply of defensive munitions. This again, unfortunately, fits in the bracket of highly reactive. As a military strategist, what would be the preferable course of action at this point in time? Because we have a red line, which is the inability to strike beyond 100 kilometers into Russian territory with US-made munitions.
I mean, this is clearly a terrible rule that the US has imposed on the Ukrainians. At the end of the day, this help Ukraine defend itself for as long as it takes is a failing strategy. It's not going to succeed. The Ukrainians know that. Any half-decent strategist knows that, because Russia will just keep throwing its people at the problem and attrit Ukraine down. Russia can afford, or at least it thinks it can afford, to lose tens of thousands a month. Ukraine just can't. It cares about every individual, and it doesn't want to lose its people to the predations of Russia. NATO really needs to rethink how it's supporting Ukraine. It needs to rethink its strategy, and its strategy must embrace supporting Ukraine to beat Russia in Ukraine as quickly as possible, because it is both a strategic and a moral imperative.
And what's the role in China in this? Again, as I say, because you have deep expertise in this area, often it's framed in terms of Taiwan, which of course is a concern. And I would wonder whether China will use the current chaos as cover to mount that invasion that's long been rumored. But on the other side, you have North Korea that is providing munitions to Russia. Is it correct to say that they would not be doing that without the blessing of China? And do we know the extent of Chinese support for Russia? How far are they prepared to push this relationship?
Well, first on China. I mean, China sees this as part of its broader ideological battle with the West and resetting the global system to be more favourable to China and to put China at the centre of global systems and multilateral organisations rather than the United States and Europe. They are having some success in that because we've been asleep at the wheel and let China take over a bunch of different multilateral organisations they have no business running, to be quite frank. But, the Chinese relationship with Russia has got closer. It's really blossomed in the last 28 months. If you have a look at trade figures, they have skyrocketed to historic highs. There are many dual-use technologies that China is exporting to Russia. That missile that hit the hospital in Kiev yesterday had about 50 Western components. Now, one of the sources of them comes through China. There'll be other sources, but China's a principal third-party supplier for a lot of those things. China's also buying a lot of cheap energy off Russia. Now, they benefit from this clearly, but they're providing a foreign currency to the Russians because it's very expensive to fight wars, even if you're a nuclear-armed power. Now, clearly, China would like to see Russia's position in the world weaken over the long term because of this war, so they benefit from that. And they are learning lots of lessons about military affairs from the war as well. So I'd sum it up by saying China's interests are served by this war continuing because it also distracts the US, it keeps the Europeans in Europe. The North Koreans, I'm not sure how much control anyone really has over that band of psychopaths. Even China, I think, only has so much leverage over Kim-Jong-Un and, whatever you want to call that governance system. But clearly, they've provided a huge quantity of munitions, from artillery munitions through to long-range rockets, hundreds of which have been used against Ukraine, potentially even machine tools to expand Russian industry to produce munitions. You should wonder what else is being exchanged in this bargain between the Russians and the North Koreans, but I don't think it would be anything that will be of benefit to democratic countries. So, for both these countries, China and North Korea, they like the fact that Russia's giving NATO a bit of a kick, even though it's not fighting NATO, it's telling the world it is. But it also, I think, supports China in its efforts to get the global south on its side. And, it's having some success in that.
And you've said that Russia and China are implacably opposed to NATO, and their actions certainly seem to support that. And you've said that this is because NATO represents freedom, defending the ability for countries to make their own decisions, and for the peoples of those countries with representative governments to make those decisions. One topic I discussed with Ben Hodges in one of the videos we've done is that another reason why Russia hates NATO is because it places limits on its imperial ambitions, limits on its expansion, and it draws a line in the sand between rule of law countries and a system which runs on entirely different principles or lack of them in Russia. And it places a limitation on how far that can expand. Do you think that is true?
No, I think that's a very good point by Ben. And, NATO protects countries that offer Russian citizens an alternate vision of governance. And Putin hates that. Putin doesn't want his people to see visions of governance where they select their rulers. No one in their right mind thinks the March election of Putin was an open, free, and fair election. I mean, it was just a farce where the outcome was determined long ago. So he hates NATO, that it preserves alternate views of how countries can be run, where citizens are free to say what they want, do what they want, worship who they want, travel where they want, work where they want. And people like Xi and Putin can't tolerate that. They don't believe they should tolerate that anymore. And that's why we see this coercive behavior against their neighbors in Europe and in the Western Pacific.
Let's turn to Ukraine now, because I think often it is left out of these discussions. It's often viewed as a sort of pawn on a chessboard, including by many so-called geopolitical realists. But one of the things I was reading from your writings, I think, is an absolutely fascinating idea, and that is the experience of failure being one of the best ways to transform not just individuals but institutions as well. And when you see a lot of the propaganda, it'll say, well, Ukraine is this, Ukraine is that, it's corrupt, etc. Underlying it, however, in Ukraine is the ability to change and learn. And we've seen over the last 30 years an extraordinary attempt that hasn't completely beaten corruption. Of course not. There's corruption in Western countries, but it's on a road of transformation. That, I think, is the important thing that is being preserved here. How important is that process of being able to reinvent yourself for military capability and strategy? And what have you observed in terms of Ukraine's achievements?
Well, I think it's enormously important for societies more broadly, whether it's military or economic or societal change. The fact that you can look at yourself, critique yourself, and improve yourself, I think, has been one of the really amazing things that we've seen the Ukrainians do since their independence, that they achieved, that they voted for back in 1991. So they've demonstrated, at least in the military, the ability to quickly learn lessons at the lower levels and share those and improve. It's, can be spotty at times, and sometimes those lessons don't get all the way to the top where it informs equipment, but it happens enough and better than the Russians that they're able to, reconstitute, to re-energize themselves and keep themselves as a viable force on the battlefield, whether it's drones, which the Ukrainians really led the way on early in the war and continue to lead the way in innovation when it comes to uncrewed semi-submersible submersible maritime drones, long range, medium range attack drones, and even drones on the ground. That's been a great area of innovation. But also, I think there's been a lot of innovation in crowdfunding unit capabilities, meshing civil and military intelligence sources and analysis. So we've seen a huge amount of innovation, and that's just in the physical world. We've seen it in the information world with strategic communications and influence operations. Not that the Russians aren't also engaging in it, they are, but theirs is more malign. So we've seen this real spirit of innovation amongst the Ukrainians. And I guess the question I pose is, imagine how they could apply that in their country if they weren't having to use it for military means. Imagine what a prosperous, vibrant democracy Ukraine would be in the heart of Central Europe. I mean, it would just be absolutely stunning. And that's the whole aim of winning this war, right? You want to win the war so you can win the peace for the people of Ukraine.
And this pace of extraordinary evolution of electronic warfare combined with drones and tactics is fundamentally changing warfare, isn't it? And we see different aspects of that in the marine environment compared to the land war. But it seems there's this incredible conjunction in Ukraine that's come together and an extraordinary communication, which has led to an evolution of these military tactics and technologies at a pace which is perhaps unheard of in other areas of history. You've got civil society, you've got tech entrepreneurs, and you've got the front line. And there seems to be a complete sort of taking down of barriers between this. Often you'll have the tech entrepreneurs who are innovating, getting stuff to the front line almost immediately, and getting data back in real time because their friends, their colleagues, their cousins, whoever are there. So you've got this incredible network of collaboration, in some ways reminiscent of Silicon Valley and the kind of innovation pace that we've seen coming out of there over the last couple of decades. It's the case that the government is perhaps not quite so agile in this, but is starting to catch up too. What is going to be the challenge for NATO and the highly bureaucratized Western militaries to actually match or learn this new pace of warfare?
Yeah, I think we've certainly seen some changes to the character warfare. I wouldn't call it a revolution just yet. Revolutions are generally more obvious in retrospect. I think there's been progress in the tactical developments of the war, but certainly not enough. I mean, I think technology still outstrips tactical and doctrinal developments. Neither side is able to really conduct large-scale offensives successfully, so that is a very significant failing on both sides at the moment. I think the counteroffensive last year demonstrated that, and the Russian offensives this year continue to demonstrate that. So in some respects, we're kind of in 1916, early 1917 on the Western Front, where you're starting to see planes, you're starting to see tanks, you're not seeing a method of bringing them all together to undertake successful, survivable offensive operations. And until we do that, it's going to be very difficult to draw this war to a conclusion. And frankly, I think this has been a failure of NATO's. NATO really needs a Manhattan Project to look at new tactics, new strategies that incorporate all these new technologies. And that's going to mean some really significant doctrinal change. It's going to take significant organizational change, and that's going to be hard for some. But fundamentally, it's going to change how we educate, train our people, and particularly our leaders, because we're now in a world where we don't just use machines, we're in a world where we partner with machines and algorithms. And our training, our education, and our leadership development models have yet to fully adapt to that model. Indeed, many of them haven't adapted at all. So, there's a lot of cultural change to come, and what we're seeing in Ukraine really is the smallest tip of a very large iceberg.
And what's the implication for the training that's being provided to Ukraine? On the basics, perhaps it's sort of solid, and on certain types of equipment and combined arms and all that kind of stuff, it's great, except that Ukraine does not have air power, which is a significant component of that combined arms approach. And I have heard it said by some who conduct training for various battalions that actually some of the training the West is providing we're going over there not to train them on electronic warfare and so on. We're going over to actually learn the innovations. So is there a problem with the way our assistance is being provided on the training front?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, our combined arms doctrine's out of date. I mean, it was last really updated in the 1990s, and it really hasn't been updated since then. But we've seen significant changes in technology and the geopolitical situation since then. So, even if we are training them combined arms, we're training them in the wrong doctrine. It's 30 years old and out of date. On air power, unless you're the United States or China, you don't have air power either. Any country in Europe or in Asia who thinks it's going to have any kind of air parity or superiority is kidding itself, unless you have the US looking after you. I mean, you look at my own country, we have 3 squadrons of F-35s. If you're a soldier, you are never going to see those things, and it's very unlikely any country in Europe is either. So we should have realized this long ago, and we haven't adapted our own doctrine because of this. On training, I think one of the problems is not enough countries have enough observers in Ukraine to be able to see what the situation is really like. You can't build training off a few intelligence reports, and we all know what intelligence reports are like, or social media. You need lots of informed observers in there. And you need the right observers. You can't have special forces people in there observing large-scale combined arms. They don't know what they're looking at. You need straight leg infantry, armour, artillery, engineers, signallers, EW, combat aviation people in there observing and seeing how they need to change doctrine and training for the future. The Americans aren't doing that. The Australians aren't doing that. The Germans aren't doing that. And a lot of other countries are not doing it. Some are doing it at a small scale, but it's not enough. And until we commit to that kind of observer corps in Ukraine of the right observers, it's going to be difficult ensuring the Ukrainians get the right kind of training from NATO countries.
I suspect the British are probably not doing it as well. I don't have any information one way or the other, but it's certainly our forces have been run down over the last couple of decades to an extent where I think those that observe this kind of thing have some considerable concerns. And there was no sign with the last government they were really going to scale it up in any meaningful sense. We don't know what the next government is going to do. But what should we be doing in order to get our defense into a proper deterrent state?
Yeah, I mean, with regards to the British military, yes, it has been run down in size, but my view would be it certainly hasn't been run down in quality. I mean, the British military, in particular the British Army, is, an extraordinary institution that's very high quality, has very high standards of training, education, and leadership. So this isn't a qualitative issue, even though we all need to update our doctrine. It really has become a quantitative issue in many countries, whether it's governments have run down defence budgets, we aren't able to recruit sufficient numbers of people, and these kind of things. I think the tragedy of the Sunak announcement about national service is that it's actually not a bad idea, because he was looking at a broad-based community service model, not just about the military, which was focused more on joining 18-year-olds to their society than bumping up the size of the military. I don't see how that is a bad idea. I really don't. Young people generally are service-minded, and many of them would jump at the chance to spend time, helping ambulance drivers, planting trees, and these kind of things. So I think we need to consider anew different forms of service, which merge professional, reserve, and national service people in the military, because frankly, we're going to need bigger organisations in future to combat not just the military threats from places like Russia and China, but also some really profound shifts in climate that are probably going to require military responses for large-scale disasters.
Now, you've written that automation is going to be absolutely critical in Ukraine, not just for victory, but for focusing their efforts on saving lives, on being really economical with how they use human resource. It's also true to say that actually innovation. I think it's a similar concept, but General Zaluzhny wrote an article about how innovation is going to win the war. Is Ukraine far better structured in terms of not just its military hierarchy, but its overall mindset than Russia to actually innovate and assimilate those innovations within its military doctrine and practice?
Well, I think so at one level at least. When I look at adaptation, I look at it at two levels. I look at tactical adaptation, which is the learning and evolution and adaptation for you to win battles. And then there's strategic adaptation, which is a broader national undertaking to learn and adapt to win wars. I think certainly the Ukrainians in tactical adaptation are miles ahead of the Russians. Even though the Russians are experimenting with different, turtle tanks and motorbike troops, that is adaptation of a form. I think where the Russians may be ahead of the Ukrainians is just the amount of resources they're able to commit to building large quantities of things once they do eventually learn a lesson from the tactical level, whether it's electronic warfare, drones, and these kind of things. The Russians are better resourced to build new things once they do learn a lesson. So, I think there's almost a stasis there in adaptation where the Russians might be better at strategic adaptation, the Ukrainians better at tactical adaptation. But there is no doubt that those who are able to learn quicker and adapt quicker have a better chance at winning than those that don't.
And you also have posted an extraordinary statistic that Russian casualties have been increasing, and you can see a clear pattern of that increase, and it is accelerated over the last 6 months. What do you think is driving this? Is it because the military decisions that are being made are politically motivated? Is it the quality of leadership? Or even is it the quality of recruits, training, and the equipment at the disposal of Russia?
Well, like all things in war, there's always more than one contributor to trends. I think the key things that contributed to Russian casualties, about 180,000 over the last 6 months. Firstly, they've gone on the offensive for 6 to 9 months. Before that, they're on the defensive. So on the offensive, you're always going to take a higher proportion of casualties compared to being on the defensive. Secondly, I think the average quality of Russian soldiers is much lower than what it was at the beginning of the war, just because of their conscription and things like this. Third, clearly the leadership isn't that tremendous. There's a very centralized leadership model. And the Russians don't like reporting failure. They'd rather bang their head against the wall 10 times than tell their boss that banging your head against the wall once didn't work. So I think there's a convergence there, but also, you've got political direction from Putin to, my sense would be said, take all of the Donbass as a minimum before you get a break and these kind of things. So I think there's a convergence of reasons for the average daily casualties to be around 1,000 for the last 6 months. Eventually, the Russians will culminate in this offensive. That will probably ease off, but I don't think they will stop attacking. They will just see a significant reduction in the number of daily attacks that they take for the back half of this year.
And another statistic you shared, which I find absolutely extraordinary, and that is the massive cost. And within that cost, clearly it shows the Russian doctrine of not valuing human life and seeing their soldiers as simply an expendable resource. But you quote here that for every 513 square kilometers, they've lost around 180,000 personnel. This seems extraordinarily profligate. Is it a poor return on investment? And what does it tell us about the future state of the war? I mean, it suggests to me at least that they have no chance of taking any major territories in Ukraine, let alone the entire country.
Yeah, no, it's extraordinarily profligate, and it's a very bad return on investment. It's about 360 people per square kilometre, and that is not a good return in investment in any war. No country can do that forever. And, when you look at the size of Ukraine, that just isn't sustainable. Even just the size of the remaining Donbass that the Russians want to occupy. I mean, that size of territory is about 3% the size of the city that I live in Brisbane, Australia. I mean, it's just a tiny dot on the map for such an extraordinary expenditure in life. Now, the Russians will say we have all the people we need to do this indefinitely. I don't think that is the case for any country, because the number of people is one thing, but at some point, society is going to decide that, this isn't worth it. The number of disabled veterans who have nothing to lose because they've already lost their legs and their eyes will have nothing to lose but to say we're not tolerating this anymore. Now, when that point is, I don't know. I mean, certainly General Zaluzhny said, I thought once the Russians lost 150,000 casualties, they'd go home. And he said, I was wrong. I wouldn't put a figure on what that is, but, it's already over 500,000. What would be that figure? 1 million? 2 million? And how many Ukrainians have to die before Russia gets there?
I suspect, unfortunately, that there is no cap to that figure. It's more a question of when the Russian economy implodes and doesn't have the manpower to keep the lights on. That unfortunately is where I think that is going to go. The last question, I know, because we're pressed for time, and that is the reports that, yes, we've had the 60 billion aid package. We've had subsequent aid packages announced. But the Kiev Independent ran a report that 15 battalions have not received the munitions they were expecting, not received the munitions they need to sustain their struggle. What is happening with supplies? What's slowing them down? What needs to change in both logistics, but also mindset of the allies supporting Ukraine? Because we seem to provide stuff incrementally. It seems to be sluggish. And it's not always matched to any kind of strategic purpose.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of dimensions to those kind of stories that you see every now and then. First, no battalion ever thinks it's got enough ammunition. And it's probably right. And it really depends what their mission is and what the priorities are for the other 100 battalions that are around them, right? So we need to take that into consideration. But yes, the pace of delivery of Western aid is an issue that we should be continually focused on and should be continually trying to speed up. I mean, Ukraine's a big country, so just getting it across the border to the front line is a very major logistic undertaking. Getting it to transshipment points in places like Poland is also a very major undertaking. And then you need to decide, well, what comes in first? Who makes that decision? So there's all these steps along the way where logistics supply lines can slow down, wrong things can be sent, they can be interfered with, who knows what cyber silliness the Russians are engaging in to disrupt logistic planning as well. Yes, I would love to see things going in more quickly. I would love to see more things going in at every stage. But, large-scale logistics is something that many countries have kind of eschewed over the last 30 years because we thought contracting things out to companies that had mottos like just do it would be the way of the future in military affairs. And whilst contractors are very important, the large-scale ability to plan and execute strategic logistics support plans that's required with Ukraine is something we're relearning.
That and the same, I guess, can be applied to things like army recruitment, training, and so on. A lot of this capability is being outsourced. But as we scale up, that may have to come back in-house and that talent to be retained within the army who know what they need best. This has been absolutely fantastic speaking to you. Of course, I have a million other questions. We'll have to save those for potentially a future session.
Well,
Mick,
I'm happy to do another session in the future. That'll be great.
That'd be absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on the channel. It's incredibly important, voices like yours, to help drive forward to Ukrainian victory. I know the audience are going to appreciate it. Thank you so much, and Slava Ukraini.
Slava Ukraini, and it's great to talk to you.